common question I get that's along the same theme of what saddle to put your adaptive riding student in. So we're going to be focusing on traditional tack and equipment. So just be aware that a super slippery saddle could actually be causing. Let's talk tack and equipment, specifically saddles as they relate to adaptive, or also commonly called therapeutic, horseback riding lessons. So what saddle you should match to your student that is participating in adaptive horseback riding lessons is a super common question that I get from instructors of various experience levels. And in my time in the industry, so over 15 years of teaching both traditional and adaptive lessons, I have had the experience of working with several different types of saddles with a very wide range of different diagnoses and disabilities, wide range of students, and then also different long-term goals that those students are working on. And this talk is hopefully going to give you some information that will help you sort through what type of saddle might set your student up for success depending on their unique physical, cognitive, and emotional abilities. So my name is Saebra Pipoly, and I'm the owner and founder of Hoof Falls and Footfalls. And through Hoof Falls and Footfalls, I am on a mission to educate, equip, and encourage adaptive or therapeutic horseback riding instructors, not only here in the US where I live, but also all over the globe. So I've been in this industry, like I said, for actually over 15 years now. And I try to take the information and the questions I get and make it super easy to understand so that you guys can have better education and tools and go out and provide safe, quality, and professional lessons to whatever student that you might be working with. And now keep in mind, we're just going to be kind of scratching the surface of tack and equipment pairings in this chat here, but there are a ton of different videos in the Intuitive Instructor Club that go more in depth on like the physics of horse and rider and tack matching that whole puzzle, and also looking at horses' build and their movement and matching it to riders, and then also different ways that you can take traditional saddles like these and adjust them to meet different physical, cognitive, and emotional needs of your students. And for the most part, with the hundreds of different students that I've worked with and the many different diagnoses that I've encountered, I can say that most of the students that you encounter in the adaptive or therapeutic riding world are going to be able to ride in traditional tack and equipment. A common question I get that's along the same theme of what saddle to put your adaptive riding student in is, oh, well, just because I'm teaching adaptive horseback riding lessons, does that mean that I need an adaptive saddle? So, like the ones that have the seat on the back or extra padding somewhere or something along those lines. That's a whole nother can of worms I'm not really going to get into, but there's actually a lot of adaptive tack out there that is marketed to adaptive or therapeutic horseback riding instructors that is not safe or ethical to use. That's a whole nother talk, like I said. So we're going to be focusing on traditional tack and equipment and weighing out the pros and the cons and what kind of works well for different types of students so that you can hopefully take this information, pair it to the tack and equipment you have in your barn, to the horses you have and the students that you have, and then hopefully make an educated guess. So the saddles I have here, including pads, saddles and pad sets, are lined up from the most supportive to the least supportive as far as support that it's going to give our students when they're riding the horse. The type of saddle that I am missing that would actually go here is an Australian saddle. I don't have one here, but just know that an Australian saddle would go here in between our Western and our Dressage, which we'll talk about here in a second, as kind of your second most supportive, because it's a bit more supportive than Dressage, not quite as much as a traditional Western here. So when we're talking about saddles and equipment in general, We are going to assume that the saddles are well made and are built in a way that are going to be setting our riders up for success. Not all saddles are created equal. I've ridden in some pretty horrible saddles where they just do not put your body in good position and you're fighting against that saddle the whole time. With riding experience and with additional physical strength and practice, could you overcome a saddle like that? Yes, but should we put our students in it when they're beginner riders or adaptive horseback riding students? Probably not. We want to try to get a saddle that's well made, well constructed, and setting them up for good posture and alignment. So that means staying centered, and then we're looking for an ear, shoulder, hip, heel as appropriate to that rider's physical ability. Some of our riders may never be able to get to that due to physical limitations, but we want to try to get them as close as that to as close to that position as we can. Okay. Another thing too that I want to touch on before we start going into the specific saddles is not only how it's made and the position it's going to be putting the rider in, but also that feel of that saddle. Some of these saddles can get really slick with the leather. Of the three that I have here, this one's probably going to be the most slick. It's not too bad though, because there is a bit of squish here. But this leather here, even though there's some texture on it, it's a little bit stiffer leather, and this saddle can get a little bit slippery. This saddle here, the seat's a little smoother, but there is some give. But here, this leather's nice and pliable. It's actually buffalo hide, has some texture on it, and it creates a little bit of friction. This saddle here, it's a rough out Western on the seat and also where your legs are going to go. So again, gives a little bit of tack and a little bit of friction to help hold your rider into place. Some saddles, I will actually not buy a super slick saddle anymore because of the type of students that I work with on a regular basis. So just be aware of a really well-constructed saddle that puts you in a good position could offer a bit more difficulty to the students if that leather is super slick. So just keep that in consideration when you're looking at the type of support and like best fit that it's going to give to your students. On that leather piece as well, before we get into saddle specifics, since that leather texture and slipperiness kind of applies across the board, I've noticed that on saddles that have a harder seat, so not any squish, and the leather's also pretty slippery, that tends to cause little wiggle tushies. So your riders are going to be kind of slipping around. They find that there's not much tack, and it causes them to want to slip around more for that sensory input. So I see that a lot in sensory processing disorder, autism spectrum, ADHD. So just be aware that a super slippery saddle could actually be causing some wiggle tushy issues, and it might actually be remedied by pairing them with a saddle that has a little bit more friction and tack. You could also maybe put like a seat saver on here. They make them for English and Western and dressage, and it could provide a little bit of squish and tack to kind of just help them find their spot in the saddle. And that little bit of friction and a little bit of squish in that seat is also going to help your rider's balance and proprioceptive system. So where they're at in space, it really helps with that as well. So that's kind of our general saddle information here. Let's talk specifically about our Western saddles first. So again, front of the lineup. So this is going to be our most supportive saddle that we have. So this is going to be good for riders who are maybe a little bit weaker. They have limited stamina. Could be really good for lower tone riders. So they have lower muscle tone than normal. We would call that hypotonia. Also good for riders that have limited strength or mobility in their legs, with a little caveat of the stirrup fenders and the stirrups here in a second, which we'll talk about. But the reason why the saddle is the most supportive for our students is because most Westerns tend to have a pretty deep seat here. Cantle goes up a little higher. Cantle, rise, can differ depending on the style and the make of the saddle, but typically as it compares to dressage and English saddles, your cantle and your seat's probably going to be a little bit higher. And then on the front end here, we've got our swells and our horn that again gives us a little bit more support on the front end. Another reason why it's more supportive is going to be your stirrup fenders here. So again, the stirrup fender, because it comes up underneath and we have leather on leather, once there's weight and leg pressure, this is going to provide a little bit of friction, which is going to hold that rider's leg in place. And again, this is why I said well-built saddles can put you in a good alignment, and not great ones can put you in bad alignment. If that stirrup is in a bad position, that's more friction than that rider has to fight against to get that leg in a good spot. So with our more supportive saddles, because there is more here, one of the drawbacks could be that the saddle weighs a lot more than a dressage or an English. That can maybe go down a little bit if you have more of a synthetic style saddle. And that synthetic style could also offer a little bit more texture and friction as well, which could be a good alternative to a fully Western saddle. So just keep in mind the weight of your tack and your equipment as you're deciding what type of saddle to put on your horse. Another potential drawback, which could also be a benefit, could be the fenders and the stirrups. So with the fenders and the stirrups, even on really well-trained leather saddles, which means that these stirrups kind of have a natural twist to them and you're not fighting them too much, with our riders who might have weakness in their lower limbs or they might have some joint discomfort, the thicker fender and the heavier stirrup can cause fatigue or discomfort in hips and knees and ankles. So just be aware of that although yes, it could provide a little bit more stability and support, depending on the type of fender and the type of stirrup, it might cause additional strain on that student. Sometimes the synthetic saddles, because this is material versus a leather, there's a little bit less pull on your joints. That might be a good trade-off as well, and may not be as much strain on there. Also keep in mind too, if you keep the traditional Western stirrup on, they absolutely must have a riding appropriate footwear, and make sure that your Western stirrup is sized appropriately to your rider's foot so that it's not too big or too small. So you might need to be prepared to swap out those stirrups depending on the size of rider that you have. So a teen may not be able to ride in the same stirrup size as an adult male. So just keep that in mind as well. With our saddle, a pro, like I mentioned, is the more support of the swell here. Could potentially give that rider somewhere to kind of put hands and maybe brace upper body a bit if they need to take an upper body break. But something we need to be aware of is the horn and even the swells when it comes to mounting and dismounting. Sometimes this can get in the way of riders who need more support or are not as strong during a croup mount, so leg goes over the horse's tail. It does make it more difficult for them to get off if they need to come forward a bit more to get their leg up and over and their body over that horse. So an option could be is finding a Western saddle or maybe like a trail or an endurance type saddle that doesn't have a horn but has the swells. They do make them. They're awesome. They're out there. And then providing them some support as they lift that leg up and over to get over the cantle. But remember that in a Western saddle, we should be leaving that left foot in the stirrup as we begin our dismount. And then once we have leg up and over, we kick that foot out and we come down. So taking both feet out during that dismount, if that's what your rider needs, a horned Western saddle is not going to be a good fit for them. Western saddles can also get a bit difficult for more involved mounts and dismounts, like your crest mount or dismount, where legs are coming up over the neck of the horse. Again, these swells and the horn can get in the way. And depending on why your student is doing that crest mount or dismount, the swells here might make it too wide for their legs to make it up and over and then come down into a more comfortable position. These swells actually might start digging into their thighs or spread their legs out too wide. So just something to be aware of with this saddle. With both the Western and the Dressage, with these deeper seats here that we have, also be aware that even though it does provide more support for the tush, which is good, it can make a rider want to lean and tip back more into it and find more contact of like top of pockets against that saddle, which often then makes them sit in more of a posterior tilt, so back on the pockets, and then we see legs start to push out, and riders then tend to struggle with upward transitions and they get left behind that motion. So like a halt to a walk, walk to trot, stuff like that. So just be aware of that. Deep seat is great, it's supportive, but we also need to make sure that we're not trying to like home our tush back into that seat too much. So that's our Western saddle here. Lots of pros, maybe some cons, but potentially a good option for your students if they're needing a lot of support. Dressage saddle is going to be our next most supportive saddle, again, since we don't have our Australian here. But our Dressage saddle is our second most supportive because of the deeper seat, like I mentioned. And then also with Dressage saddles, the way that this this stirrup flap here is set up, it is going to help put the rider's body in appropriate alignment. So if they're sitting here, this flap is a little bit more straight down and it's going to allow that leg to fall underneath of the rider's body. Depending on your Dressage saddle, the thigh block here can be very minimal to none, or you can have a little bit more substance of that thigh block. And that can help kind of keep that leg back in position. This one's awesome because this is actually Velcro. You can Velcro on and off, so you can make it more or less supportive depending on your rider's needs. And this saddle too, depending on that thigh block, could be a good option for somebody who needs a bit more support, but can't have all of this stuff here like our Western saddle, because maybe they need to ride with legs a little bit further forward because they have limited range of mobility, or they're really tight in their pelvis area, whatever it might be. So it'll have that deeper seat, and support here is going to depend on your saddle, but it also, on a well-made saddle, again, that caveat of is it well-made and well-balanced, it could set that rider up for good alignment where they're not having to fight their tack and their equipment very much. So here we're looking at the seat and then where that stirrup bar is coming out of, which gives you pretty good, there's not too big of a gap here. And this is an adult size saddle, so we would want to keep that in mind when we're working with our riders. Totally different topic. I have another video on it, but I would rather a rider ride in a saddle too big for them and we just have to keep kind of scooching them forward a little bit than have a rider ride in a saddle that is too small. That's a definite no-go because of the discomfort that it can cause the rider and the horse. So just be aware of that support here. This saddle could be a good option for riders who need supported mounts and supported dismounts, both croup, so leg over tail, or crest, leg over neck when we're getting on and off, because we don't have the swells and the horn here like we do on our Western saddle, and our cantle could potentially be a little bit lower depending on the build of that Western saddle. So this could be a good kind of happy medium between the support and the position it's going to put your rider in versus jumping from like a Western all the way to like just a traditional English, which could be a close contact or an all-purpose. So that's your Dressage here. All of my Dressage saddles run about 17-ish pounds right now, 15 to 17. So this is definitely going to be lighter than most of your Western leather saddles, or maybe a touch lighter than a synthetic Western saddle, kind of depending on the make and the build and the size of them. All right, so that's our Dressage. So we're going to come here to this English saddle. The one I have here is specifically a close contact English saddle. There is also an all-purpose English saddle, but the general information is going to be very similar between an all-purpose and a close contact. The difference between the two is an all-purpose saddle, which is not this one, this is a close contact. An all-purpose sets you up to do some flat work and also maybe some jumping, so it's kind of like an all-purpose style saddle that sets you up to do different stuff. A close contact is geared more for over fences type work. So the difference between the two is going to be seen in the seat. So a close contact saddle is going to have a little flatter seat than an all-purpose. Your all-purpose might have a little bit more of a seat here. And then your flap on a all-purpose is going to be a little bit more directed down, not quite as much as a dressage, but a little bit more directed down, so you could ride shorter for jumping or a little longer for flat work. And then your close contact, the flap is going to be angled a bit more forward, and this knee roll is going to come out a touch further, again, because this is more for jumping. So you're going to ride with a little shorter stirrup and a little bit more bend in your hip and your knee, okay? So those are the difference between the two. But all-purpose or close contact, both of them are going to be less supportive than your dressage and your Western, just due to construction. If I had a rider that needed to be in a saddle but had limited range of motion, so maybe they are tight muscle, so if they have hypertonia, they are high tone, and maybe some spasticity in those legs and the hips, this saddle might be a better choice than a dressage because of this more forward flap, because they can ride in a little bit more shorter stirrup, a little bit more support, bring that leg a little more forward, and we don't have to bring it down quite underneath of us as to how a dressage saddle would kind of naturally put that leg. So this could be a really great option for our riders who have a little bit more limited range of motion through the pelvis and the legs. And again, we're seeing that in hypertonia, high tone. I would be cautious of putting a rider with low tone, hypotonia, in this saddle, because again, with how the flaps are set more forward than a dressage saddle, and then typically that stirrup bar is set a bit further forward than where the seat is at, again, because you're going to be doing some jumping and potentially riding with shorter stirrup. In a low tone rider, or a rider that's hypotonia and kind of a little bit slouchier sitting, maybe weaker muscle as well, this could cause them to maybe sit in a bit more of a chair seat or back on those pockets and get slouchy and then push those legs forward. So just be cautious of a saddle like this for your lower tone riders, but could potentially be great for higher tone, where we do need those legs up and shorter, and they're going to have to ride in a bit more of a chair seat, which means feet are more out in front of the hip than is a traditional riding position, but might be the most realistic position for that rider, okay? Mounts and dismounts are going to be pretty similar to dressage, but potentially a little bit easier for more supportive, because our seat and our pommel are not as high and we've got a little bit less tack and equipment. Depending on your all-purpose or close contact saddle, you could have a knee roll here. You could also have a calf block here at the back. This one doesn't have it. Or you could have just a completely flat one. Like I grew up old school. We had nothing there. It was flat. All these saddles are so nice and squishy and have some support now, but that's something to consider as well, depending on how it's made, okay? All right, so we have our Western, we have our dressage, we have our English saddle, and then last but not least, we have our bareback pads. So the reason why they're at the end is because they are the least supportive of all of our tack and our equipment. I'm going to do a different video on this that goes more into my theory on why I don't start my students in pads anymore. I used to, but big hint and spoiler, it's because they're the least supportive. And these are actually a progression from a saddle. So if we put students in this when we absolutely do not need to, we are actually throwing more difficulty at them that can push them out of what we call their zone of proximal development and make it harder for them to progress at an appropriate speed that they're actually capable of progressing at. There's more presentations on bareback pads and zone of proximal development in the Intuitive Instructor Club, so make sure if you want to learn more about those, check that out. But with our bareback pads, even though we have less here, and it could be a lot easier to get our riders on and off of the horse because we don't have the cantle or the pommel, we also don't have any structure here to help our riders stay in a good position. Again, assuming these saddles are made fairly well and putting you in a good position. So with this pad set, I've got two different ones here that I'll show you. Even though this is a thicker wool pad and this one's a little thinner like foam, both of these give very limited protection to the horse's back. And so we need to be very, very cautious of putting riders on these that weigh more than 50 to 70-ish pounds, because seat bones are going to be digging right into our horse's back. Yes, even if we have this and a Western pad underneath, but even if you go Princess and the Pea style and stack, 3 or 4 Western pads, which I have seen before, then you're going to run into the issue with your tack and your equipment rolling, because we're lacking the structure and the support that a treed saddle is going to give you. So bareback pads absolutely have their place, but just keep in mind that they are least supportive, so probably should be a progression, and they may not set our rider up for a good position. Again, check out videos on it in the Intuitive Instructor Club. I'll probably do a chat that I'll share on YouTube and podcasts later. But because the horse's withers are here, it also sets your rider up for more of a posterior chair seat versus a saddle that's going to set them up for better alignment if that saddle is constructed well. Another thing to consider is that a bareback pad goes directly on your horse's back. And so when that happens, it's actually going to cause a horse to feel wider because you're sitting directly on that back, versus putting a saddle on a horse and sitting on the saddle where the twist of the saddle here is actually raised up above your horse's back and more narrow than that horse. So even though common school of thought that's very prevalent in the adaptive and therapeutic riding world is to put tight, spastic, or hypertonia riders, so that high tone in pad sets, because those legs can't relax down underneath of them. If possible, it might actually be more beneficial to them to ride in like a close contact or all-purpose style, maybe even a dressage saddle that has no thigh block, because it's going to make the back of the horse feel more narrow. So don't get fooled by the optical illusion of, oh, I'm putting less leather on my horse, therefore they are going to feel more narrow. That's actually not the case. And thank you to one of my mentors, Jenny Nell Hartung, for teaching me this concept. And she has a whole presentation on it in the Intuitive Instructor Club. But that really got me rethinking about what order and my saddle choice when I match student to saddle and to horse. So keep that in mind when you are matching equipment. Also, with our saddles, we have the option of adding stirrups on. And that can be really, really great for riders to be able to progress more. They can learn 2-point, they can learn how to go over obstacles, they can learn posting, and also that weight bearing. So being able to put their feet into their stirrup can be very beneficial for both high and low tone. So that can be another benefit of our saddle. Pads, even if it comes with a little spot to smack on a pair of stirrups, do not put stirrups on a bareback pad, period. Even if it's a tiny little rider that weighs 30 pounds, we don't have a tree that's holding this pad in place. And so if we have stirrups on that pad set and that little bit of weight, yes, it may only be 20 or 30 pounds, probably 30 by the time you're working with 4 and up age-wise, that pad is easily going to rotate on your horse's back because we don't have that tree of the saddle and the structure of the saddle helping to hold it into place. No matter how tight you get your girth or cinch or whatever is holding that pad on. And if it's not rotating a significant amount, it probably means that your girth is way too tight onto that horse. You can't counteract that turn by over tightening your girth or your cinch for your bareback pad. So just be aware of that as well. I know that is very common with a lot of programs and instructors. I've even been guilty of using that in the past before I knew better. So now that I know better, I do better. And you never ride with stirrups on a pad, even if that person has a 2-sidewalker team. It is not worth the safety risk and the potential things that can go wrong with the student and with the horse, okay? So we have all of our saddles here that we talked about. I really hope that all the pros and the cons have helped giving you more information to make an educated guess on what type of saddle might be a best fit for your student. Even though we have all this information, sometimes it just takes trial and error. So you can start with your best guess, but you might want to swap a saddle around, try a rider in close contact versus a dressage or a Western versus a dressage, but be very cautious of letting the saddle type block you from putting a rider into a saddle that might be the best fit for them. We can learn a lot of good general riding because good riding is good riding no matter the saddle that you're in. Don't get blinded by it being a Western or a dressage or an English saddle or a bareback pad, okay? Good riding is good riding. We have to teach that to our students and their families because often they don't see that. With that being said, of all the information about the best saddle match for your students, remember that we have to prioritize saddle fit to the horse first. So fit your saddles to the horse, not only sideways across their back, but also length of the saddle, making sure that that seat isn't too long because you're just trying to fit bigger riders onto that horse. So appropriate saddle fit first, then based off of what saddles your horse has available and that horse's weight limit and their specific skills and training and personality, then we match that student to that horse. Some of us have options of having multiple different saddles or saddle types to go on one horse. Some of us, we only have one style of saddle that goes on the horse. So you have to kind of work with what you have, but remember, prioritize the saddle to the horse first, and then we fit that student to that horse and to that saddle. And sometimes we do have to say, no, not right now, because we don't have the appropriate saddle and horse match for that student that's coming into our program. So that's where Groundwork's a great alternative. Put them on a wait list, or have them do groundwork temporarily and maybe save up for a different style or size of saddle if it's going to actually fit your horse well. Okay, so hopefully that was some information that you can put into use. Let me know what your favorite tip or tidbit was that you got out of this presentation or this instructor chat. I'd love to hear from you. And also, no matter where you're listening, whether it's YouTube or a podcast or Intuitive Instructor Club, make sure that you comment down below and let me know if you have any other topics that you would like to discuss as it relates to adaptive or therapeutic horseback riding, teaching theory and technique, volunteer management, horse management, anything in our adaptive horseback riding and adaptive horsemanship and groundwork world. And thank you so much for tuning in. Please like and subscribe and share whatever platform you're on. That's going to help you know when the next video is out. And that lets the powers that be with all this technology know that instructors like you want to hear more educational information like this.